Good evening everyone. Welcome to the FCC. We don't do night event that often, but we would have done anything to host Alan, so very welcome to this special dinner. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm the current president of the club, another 2 months. So it's a great pleasure to host Alan Rusbridger tonight. He is currently the principal of Lady Margaret Hall at Oxford, where he also chairs the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. And I guess he will tell us a bit more about what does that imply later. As you all know, and it's probably the reason we're here tonight, Alan was the editor-in-chief of The Guardian for 20 years. He oversaw its transformation into a world-leading digital news organization. Under his leadership, the paper became one of the most visited English serious websites in the world. And under his time, the newspaper led investigation into WikiLeaks and the Snowden revelations that we will discuss again, and won numerous awards, including the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Alan Rusbridger has just written about the transformation and the challenges of the news industry that he obviously witnessed in a book called Breaking News, The Remaking of Journalism and Why It Matters Now. We are delighted to welcome you here, Alan, not only because it's a full house, but also because this place, as you may know, shares your concerns about the future of journalism, and we are all very eager to hear your views. Please welcome Alan Rusbridger.
Well, thank you very much for coming, and thank you for that very generous welcome. I realized I was last here, I think, in 1986, and in the way of somebody asked me what story was I covering, and of course I couldn't remember. I'm sure it was important at the time, but I do remember having a drink with Claire Hollingworth in the bar, so that was memorable. So I'm going to talk a bit about the thoughts that have rattled through my head trying to write this book, and it was an attempt, really, having stopped editing, to think about this amazing revolution that we're all living through. And the advantage of not editing is that you have a chance to reflect in the way that you don't when you are editing, and you can try and sort of work out what it all means, or stumble towards some sense of what it's meaning. Those of you who don't know who I am may have seen me being played by Doctor Who in the Fifth Estate. You may know about that story, which was about the closure of a newspaper, which was the result of the phone hacking story that we did. So that was what one was a Steven Spielberg film, and then we had George Clooney trying to buy the rights of the phone hacking. Well, he's bought the rights of the phone hacking film. I think if he went to the gym a bit, he could play me quite nicely. We put a cabinet minister in jail at one point. You may have read that story. You may have seen him at some point. We might want to talk about him later. And then I had the serial experience of playing myself in the film about Snowden. So these bizarre things kept happening towards the sort of the last 5 years of the time that I was editing, including that. That's what happens to an Apple Mac when the British government comes in and says, will you stop writing about something, because if you don't, that's what we're going to do to your machines. And it's quite hard to destroy an Apple Mac, but that's what it looks like when the British government has destroyed an Apple Mac, and we might want to talk about that. And another strange moment when you are forced to appear before your own parliament, and suddenly somebody asks this question: do you love your country? The implication being that you can't report on your own country's national security without in some ways being disloyal to your country, which was a moment of sort of profound questioning about what journalism is and what journalism the status that journalism has in relation to the government. So in trying to write about 20 years, I did a graphic, and you can see why I never got a career in the graphic business. And down at the bottom were all the stories that we were writing, and up at the top were the kind of things that all newspapers do from time to time in terms of reorganization. Then the dark green was our attempts to cope with the digital revolution. And you could just see there, in 2006, this extraordinary period where something called Facebook started and something called Twitter started, and then the iPhone was invented. And I think that's a sort of measure of the revolution that if you had told me in April 2006 that Facebook had anything to do with journalism at all, or that Twitter would become one of the most powerful news organizations in the world, I just simply wouldn't have believed you. It seemed like a complete irrelevance to what we were doing. And it's terribly easy to look back in hindsight and say, all that must have been obvious. Well, it just, those of you who were alive at the time, it wasn't obvious. And I still think that the scale of what has happened is still beyond our grasping. So that piece of technology, a printing press, which is what many of us in the room used to, that was our main piece of technology. The implications behind that being our mode of distribution, because it was the norm for 200 years, it seemed normal that the position of a journalist was more or less as I am tonight, slightly above the audience, in a position in which we had something we thought of as authority, which we could sell as we handed almost literally down to the audience below, and they would, God bless them, hand money up to us. And because that seemed like the natural order of things, it's very natural to want to go back to that and say, well, that's what we want to get back to. And I think it's infinitely more complicated than that. And lots of people have made parallels with this other extraordinary revolution. So you've got these two revolutions 500 years apart, and it took about 100 years at least for people to begin to understand what that revolution meant. And I think we're about 2 minutes into the second revolution, and already people are saying, oh, let's go back to what it was before, because that was much simpler. And I had this vivid image of writing this book that within the space of about 10 years, a world that had arranged itself vertically, here we are above you, handing down the information that we have that you can't easily access yourself, so you're just going to have to trust us because basically we're all you have, has been replaced by a world in which 4 billion people can talk to each other. And we're only beginning to understand the consequences of that and the implications of that politically and obviously in terms of what we do as journalists. And unless you can believe that to be the case, then I think we're in a poor position to understand how we're going to justify the position of journalism in society going on. The historian Niall Ferguson has just written a book called The Tower and the Square, in which he's making the same point between the tower and the public conversation in the square, and we can talk about whether it's one square or multiple squares, but you sense the world is being shaped by completely different forces that even existed before April 2006, when these things suddenly appeared from nowhere and began to change the world drastically. So, again, in retrospect, as I sat down to write this book, these questions, I found myself asking much more basic questions than I thought I would when I started on the book. So the first question is, are we better than the internet as journalists? Because we know that the internet destroys everybody unless they're the best. So are we better than the internet? The second question, an equally big question, they're all big questions, what public interest do we serve? The third question, which is sort of related, maybe we have to think of ourselves and speak of ourselves and present ourselves and believe that we are a public service, almost like a police service or an ambulance service or the fire service, that a world in which you no longer can say reliably what is true and what isn't true is a world of complete chaos, and you can't have government and you can't have politics and you can't have science. Nothing works unless you can agree on the basic facts, and that seems to me a public service. But is that how we speak of ourselves? Number 4 question is quite a big one. What is journalism? Are we clear amongst ourselves in relation to the other four questions? And do we know how we can argue that case publicly? I do think we have to be as fundamental of this in thinking about what it is that we do. And it seems to me you have to ask those questions, and you might have others, but you have to ask big questions like that before you get to the final question, which is there a business model to support what we do? And I suppose if we're honest, we don't know about the answer to that, but it seems to me it's the wrong way around to start with that question without asking the other questions. If you ask the other questions and the answer is straight to that, then there might be, or there might not be, and if there isn't, then we have to think, what's the plan B? Now, the easy book to write, and maybe this is the next book that I will write, would be to just tackle the West Coast giants. And there's Paul Dacre's opinion of Facebook, deeply tarnished, filth peddling, tax dodging, blah, blah, blah. And it's not that he's wrong, but if that's all that you think about Facebook, and we all want to blame the ills of journalism and the troubles that we're in on Facebook, then again, I think we're starting with the wrong place. It also doesn't explain that. I think we have to have the humility to say, well, what is it that is so stunningly attractive and beguiling about Facebook that you have a chart like that compared with a chart that looks like that for virtually all newspapers anywhere in the world. So as I say, although it would have been it would be an easy book to say hurrah for journalism and boo to social media, but it seems to me the world is more complicated than that. So the question, are we better than the internet? Well, I was writing this book in 2016, and there were a couple of things that really made me doubt whether there was an easy answer to that. And one of them was this. I by then was a civilian, and I thought this is an amazingly complicated question that Britain is being asked, and if you're following the news today or for any point during the last 2 years, I think we can all agree it's quite a complicated question. And as a citizen, I wanted journalism to make me a better informed citizen so that I could make a better choice. That's the classic defense of journalism, that I become a better informed citizen, I can make a better choice, and then we end up with a better society. John Dewey, Walter Lippmann, the great debate in the 1920s. And that's not what most of the British press did. Most of the British press looked like that. This was not a press that was prepared to entertain the possibility that there were two sides to the question. There was one side to the question, and they were going to use their front pages, their inside pages, their news reporting, and their editorials and their columns to make the same point repeatedly. The Reuters Institute study of that referendum found that it was 2-1 leave to remain. And it's worse than that. There's Richard Desmond, the owner of the Daily Express. So he owns a printing press. Why does he own a printing press? Because he used to be a pornographer. He used to publish a magazine called Asian Babes and have so that's his qualification for owning a printing press. And there he is beginning the campaign by signing a cheque for £1 million to the main Brexit party. So that was the last thing on his mind, was that he was going to do the kind of journalism that we thought we should do. There was the Sun actually having to register as a player because they were printing big posters telling people that they wanted people to stick up in their windows. And then you had these extraordinary front pages which were bullying, hectoring, defying people to ignore the will of the people, calling judges the enemies of the people because they insisted that espresso should go to Parliament, and so on and so forth. And you know, many books will be written about the role of the press there, but I don't think you can say that this was better than the internet. I really don't. I after a while found myself going to Twitter first because there were genuinely knowledgeable people who were willing to get to grips with the complexity of this question and who really knew what they were talking about and weren't just going to shout. And I think it's a big question that whether journalism like that is going to survive if it's in competition with the internet. And the second issue that troubled me was climate change. I won't assume that everyone accepts that there is a thing called climate change, but I hope that most people in the room would, and that we play a part in creating it, and that most of the scientific consensus is there. And it seems to me, if that is true, it is one of the biggest stories of our lifetime, if not the biggest story. And you would expect that to reflect in journalism, and again, it often doesn't. And when it does, it appears it filtered through an extreme form of skepticism. Here's a man called James Delingpole, who is the climate change correspondent of Breitbart, and these are the sort of things that he thinks. He just doesn't believe in climate change. He doesn't believe in any of it. He says it's a revolution, we've got truth and justice on our side, we owe the enemy nothing, and we really shouldn't count our jobs done until we've crushed them, seen them driven before us, and heard the lamentations of their women. So it's sort of P.G. Woodhouse meets Boris Johnson. And that's fine. You say, okay, well, that's the internet. That's Breitbart. That's not proper reporting. But if you put his name into a search engine, he's all over the British press. He is the climate change go-to guy, spouting this nonsense in numerous, actually not just in Britain. And at that point you think, well, I can't explain this. We're in an existential moment where we're expecting the public to trust us because we do this thing called journalism, which is better than the internet, and we have a craft of journalism and reporting, and yet James Delingpole is the guy we go to talk about climate change. So why would anybody trust newspapers that behaved in that way? And I struggle to find an answer to that. But we know what's happening. We know that all studies of trust in the press, there's the UK there way down as the least trusted institution, and it's improved slightly in the last year, but it's still appalling levels of trust. And for too long, all the journalists I knew used to shrug and say, oh, well, if we're hated by everyone, that shows that we're doing something right, or some platitude like that we're never going to be loved. But I think this is a major problem in a world in which we are saying that society does need people who can be the arbiters of what is truth and what isn't truth, and be the arbiters of what is fact and what isn't fact. And if people are not prepared to give us the benefit of the doubt, then in a world in which we're thinking about the existential threat, that's not great. Okay, so what public interest do we serve? I'm going to talk a bit about one way that we define that on the Guardian, and I think I'm speaking to the converted here, so I won't labour this point, but that's Nick Davis, who did the phone hacking story, and it was a story that took him 7 years from start to finish, from the first clues about that to the closure of the News of the World and the Leveson inquiry. And again, I'm not going to make the point in this room about the cost of doing that, or the legal fees, or the institutional strength of a newspaper, and how a newsroom and its lawyers and its managers all come together to do something like that. That was the story that put Andy Coulson into jail. He was a scary guy to take on. That was a South African drug peddler who was marketing nonsense pills to South Africans who had HIV and was effectively killing them. There was Jonathan Aitken, the cabinet minister, who ended up in jail. I think the headline tells you why. There's another Tory MP we were engaged in a 3-year battle with. Again, the headline tells you why. That I've already showed you is what happens when you start doing the kind of reporting on national security that governments don't like. That was Barclays Bank. These were all the massive tax dodgers in the UK. Happened to be all our major advertisers as well, but we went ahead and did it. This was an extraordinary story about the police infiltrating protest groups with people, with coppers who sort of grew their hair and had their ears pierced, and then started sleeping with the women in these groups and sometimes fathering babies, would be there for 3 or 4 years, and then they would be called back to Scotland Yard and they would just disappear out of these women's lives, and the women had no idea who these men were until The Guardian did that story, and that's now a major public inquiry in the UK. We did toxic dumping, we did slavery, we did torture and rendition, we had our correspondents locked up all over the world. We did him. We did the corrupt deal with that story took nearly 20 years of a reporter to do. We did the death of Ian Tomlinson at the G20 riots. The police said he had a heart attack. Well, our readers came up with the evidence that he hadn't had a heart attack. He was killed by being hit from behind by a policeman. And during these times, it occurred to me that actually we can't even agree as journalists what the public interest looks like. So that was the response to the Snowden inquiry, the Snowden stories that we did, and that was just one paper that was effectively saying, why don't you prosecute the editor of The Guardian and lock him up, because this is not the public interest. And all those stories about what Snowden revealed, which I think increasingly were in the public interest, we couldn't really agree as a community of journalists in the UK whether that was in the public interest or not. And it raised this huge question of how do you decide, how do we explain to the public what we think of the public interest is? I think this story has grown more salience now that we know what Facebook is up to with privacy and Google and Apple and Amazon. And it seems to me, if we don't know whether these gigantic organizations who are amassing information on us are sharing that with governments, if we don't know that and we can't even discuss it, that's a very profound statement about what journalism is for. I couldn't help thinking about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers when I was editing that story. There was a man who did exactly what Edward Snowden did, but in revealing the truth about the Vietnam War, and went to the New York Times with it. New York Times published it. This was 47 years ago. The state, in the form of the Nixon government, came out and said this was an appalling thing to do. We defined the public interest as the American administration, and this is not the public interest. And thank God we had the Supreme Court that said, no, this is absolutely in the public interest, and you have to have people in society who can reach an independent judgment about the public interest that is independent from the state. And if we can't agree as a bunch of journalists that that is the most fundamental thing that we are entitled to do, then let's all pack up and go home. And you get this thing where there's Daniel Ellsberg now on the left. He's 87, and everyone thinks he's tremendously cuddly. And Steven Spielberg's just made a film about him, and yet we feel very conflicted about Edward Snowden. I took that picture of him a couple of years ago in a Moscow hotel room, and I suspect in 50 years' time we will think about Edward Snowden as we think today about Daniel Ellsberg. So the related question about, well, are we a public service? Is this the story that we want to tell the public? And we know that the story we told when when money sloshed in and we didn't have to worry about the technology and we didn't have to watch about the money. Those were the kinds of things that we were always in. We were there to hold power to account, to record, to be the people who said this happened and this didn't happen, and to hold all kinds of power to account. And we also know that because of the financial crisis that the press is suffering, that all these things are being cut. This was the Cancross review in the UK that's just come out last month, measuring exactly the degree to which newspapers are now abandoning the reporting of courts, abandoning the reporting of councils, and it's quite a difficult narrative to say, yes, we are the public interest, we are the public service, we are there to be your eyes and ears, and at the same time to say, well, actually, we can't really afford to do that, so we're not going to do that. And so we've got all these confusing narratives about what it is that we're trying to do, and we can measure now the disengagement. That's 50% disengagement now from the public, saying, well, actually, we no longer want to be engaged in a way that classically we thought that was our role. We're not engaged any longer. And even more frighteningly, 2/3 of respondents in the Settlement survey say we can no longer actually tell good journalism from bad journalism. Really, really scary figures, these things that are beginning to feed through, I think, because we're not able to think clearly enough about how we want to present ourselves. So what is journalism? And this becomes a really difficult question because there are many things that are journalism. The Sun is journalism, the New York Times is journalism, Fox News is journalism, the Financial Times is journalism, Daily Mail is journalism, the BBC is journalism. They're all called journalism, and yet they're very different ideas of what journalism is. There are many different kinds and forms of journalism, and it becomes, I think, a very confusing thing, in all the narratives that we're trying to do in order to justify the position of journalists in society. It's a very complicated thing to do because it's a very complicated thing that we do. Again, it's not clear to me as a group of people who are excellent communicators how we quite do this. Okay, I'm nearly there. So to get back to our relationship now that the role of the printing press is fading and the role of the 4 billion people talking to each other is increasing. All those words on the left, it seemed to me, describe some of the attributes of this new world, and all those words on the right are the kind of opposite. And it seems to me, and this is what I tried to do a bit in the book, and it was certainly what I tried to do while editing, was to say, well, we're going to make lots of mistakes here, but let's try and learn what it is that people find so powerful about social media. So the first word is listening, and that's doing the opposite of what I'm doing at the moment, but I will stop in a second. And you see it on Twitter at its best, where people say things and then they listen and then they respond. And they don't take it for granted that you will trust them, that they will produce their evidence in the form of a link or in the form of a screenshot. And it's much more informal and conversational, and it's a much more level world than the old hierarchical press in which we had the printing press. And it seems to me there's something very powerful going on there. This is how people learn how to trust and test and challenge and respond to and iterate arguments today, rather than sitting back and passively accepting something. And if we think that's true, then we have to ask ourselves, does our journalism look anything like those words on the left, or does it still look more like the words on the right? I'm going to kind of end on that little section. There's Glenn Greenwald, who is a polarizing figure for some. That's his newsroom. He works in his kitchen in Rio de Janeiro with his 13 rescue dogs. And at the time that we hired him on The Guardian, he came to us having never been trained to be a journalist. He'd been a lawyer. And no one had said to him, the thing about journalism, Glenn, is what you do is you write your story, you press send, then you go down to the pub. And in his innocence, Glenn thought, well, surely the moment that you press send is the moment at which, that's the beginning of the story, isn't it? Because that's the point at which people start to read it, and it acquires a life. So Glenn would make himself a cup of tea, go back to the kitchen table, and talk to the readers. I know it's a thing we all hate doing, but he loved doing it. And his readers would pile in and say, actually, your story's not quite right, and your second paragraph could be improved, and your third paragraph would have a link, and I think you could put in a fifth paragraph that contains a reference to this. So his story got better during the course of the evening as a result of his conversations with readers, the opposite of what most newspapers do. And that new media adage, our readers know more than we do, well, one of his readers was called Edward Snowden, who knew a great deal more than Glenn Greenwald, and that's how we ended up getting the Pulitzer Prize. There's your friend, Ewan. And it took someone like Glenn Greenwald to completely invert the way that journalism was done in order to do what now the newspaper did. And by the time we hired Glenn, he had a personal following of 1 million readers who were following him on Twitter, and who said, for better or worse, we trust this guy because we feel he listens and he responds, and he's not just up talking to us. Okay, the final question: is there a business model to support what we do? Well, I'm not going to try and preach to anyone about that, because everyone's going to have a different approach to this. Every paper is different, a local paper, international paper. A paper for the rich is going to be different from a paper in the English language is going to be different from a paper in Norwegian. So there's no simple answer to that. If I was editing the Financial Times, I would definitely put up a paywall, because we're advertising to people who can spend £23,000 on a watch. And that is the average salary of the Guardian reader. So Guardian readers can't afford watches like that. So we're always going to have a different model from the Financial Times. We knew that we were living in a world in which print was going to go like that, and that digital was going to go like that, and those two lines were never going to meet. And we also knew that we were going to have to do something like this, in which it would be a long time before we could show even the slightest profit. But what we had to do was, first of all, grow the audience, which is roughly what Amazon has done. And I've not been there for 3 years now, but I read what The Guardian is doing. We started a membership scheme in 2012. We have the Scott Trust behind us, which has got a big endowment, but no bigger than Rupert Murdoch's endowment. And they say they're going to be breaking even in 2019, this year. And it's really interesting, because I'm sure if those of you who read The Guardian get really irritated by all the little ads that keep popping up saying, will you give us the money? And this was as a result of a conversation with the readers in about 2013. So I did a conversation with them with Clay Shirky, and Clay Shirky said, look, at some point, you're going to have to start paying for The Guardian. So I'm going to try 2 different models on you. Number one is you pay for The Guardian so it's a private good, so that you can read it so other people can't read it. Who's up for that? Almost no hands went up. And I thought, oh God, we're in trouble here. And Clay then turned to the readers and said, well, who would like to pay for The Guardian so that it's available for the whole world to read? A public good, because the world needs reliable news. And 90% of the hands went up. So that's what we embarked on. And The Guardian now has 1 million people paying for The Guardian, but in order to keep it open. Now, lots of people think this is a rubbish way of doing things. Some people get very angry with The Guardian that we do this, but nevertheless, there seems to be a public interest and public service that The Guardian is doing, and it's almost a form of philanthropy in the eyes of some readers that they do it. And lots of people are now thinking about this. Who pays for Wikipedia? God, a mean lot, honestly. I use Wikipedia almost every day of the year, and about once a year I get a little email saying, we notice you use Wikipedia, would you give us some money? And I do, because I think, well, that's fair. I used it a lot, and that's the model for NPR and the Texas Tribune and the Marshall Project. And so there is a new, different kind of model which is beginning to develop, which is embodied in this idea of the public interest and of public service. And it strikes me that all that investigative journalism that we did turned out to be the business model. And people would have thought that was a mad thing to say 7 years ago, and we had accountants tearing our hairs out, as anybody else, at the cost of this. But what it did was to implant in the mind of the Guardian reader that was something they recognized to be journalism. That they thought was a public interest, that was a public service, and they were willing to pay for that, especially if it was available to everybody else. Now, everybody else's business model will be different, but it was a business model that it has transpired, has worked, because it is about staying true to the necessity of journalism and the reason that we're all here. So one of the reviewers of this book said, I don't know how he got to this, he said there are 536 questions in this book and not many answers, and I feel I've probably done the same tonight. But we're about 2 minutes into this revolution, and it seems to me we are at the stage where we have to be asking these questions, and let's hope the answers follow.
Thank you very much. Indeed, many more questions and answers. But if I could start by a preliminary question for you. How do you inform yourself now that you... How do you inform yourself?
Well, I read the great newspapers that you would expect me to read. I pay for some.
I'm not sure which one I expect you to read. Mm-hmm. Can you give us some names?
I suppose what I was going to say is that I've got 2 or 3 on my iPad that I turn to first thing in the morning. But then I find myself, it's a bad habit, I know, but I follow Twitter a lot during the course of the day because I like the fact that Twitter is sending me all over the place. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's the opposite of a filter bubble. So I really want to find out multiple versions of stories. And so having done my sort of breakfast routine, which is less than it was when I was editing, I then delight in seeing where I'm sent during the course of the day.
But so you start with which newspapers? Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry.
Very persistent, isn't you? Well, I have the Guardian, I have the Times, I have the FT, I have the New York Times, and the Washington Post on my iPad. Okay. And as I say, I don't read them all as religiously as once I did, but yeah.
Great. Well, I was going to start with the business model, but I feel that that's what you have most touched on towards the end of of your presentation. So I think we will skip to the Edward Snowden episode, because Hong Kong, of course, has a very strong link to Edward Snowden. At the time, we were all chasing for him when we knew he was hiding somewhere. And just today, we've heard that one of his carers got asylum status in Canada. So you were the editor-in-chief when The Guardian got access to the hard drive provided by Edward Snowden. And then there was this decision to destroy it. And I've seen the argument that this was the price to pay to keep access to the NSA or something. But can you revisit the episode and explain what happened exactly?
Yeah, well, so we had been publishing for about 10 days, and I kept on thinking at some point the British government is going to lift the phone to me, and eventually the cabinet secretary said, "Can I come and see you this afternoon?" And we had a perfectly polite chat because we're all British, and he said, "We don't like what you're doing, and we think you've had enough fun and you should stop." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting, but that's not the way things happen. You know, it's not for you to tell me what judgments my newspaper should make. So if you don't mind, I'll go on publishing." So he kind of sighed and said, okay, well, it can't go on for much longer. And then he went away, and then he came back a week later and said, "It's got to stop." and there was a new steel in his tone. But I had by then worked out that this was what was going to happen. And so I had rung up Jill Abramson on the New York Times, and we had got all the material with the New York Times and with ProPublica. So there was a copy in America. And then the cabinet secretary said, look, we're going to destroy all your computers. And I said, well, if anybody's going to destroy them, it'll be us. But by all means, come and oversee them. We'll smash them up. But I have to tell you, we will go on reporting from New York, because I have something called the First Amendment. And for reasons I still don't understand, the British state still thought it was important to destroy our computers, even though the material was in New York. So we had a morning of smashing up all the computers in the basement of The Guardian, and then I just took the next flight over to New York and edited it from New York. But it obviously satisfied somebody. The alternative would have been to have waited for whatever they were going to do, so they would have either sent the police in or served an injunction on us, like Nixon and Ellsberg. And because Britain doesn't have the First Amendment, I wasn't confident that British judges would be as resolute as American judges. But there's I think there's a lesson for all of us here, which has come out with the Paradise Papers and so forth, that if you can harness yourself to the First Amendment, why not do so? So, if you can team up with an American publisher and say, we would like to publish with you because there's going to be safety in numbers, and actually you've got better laws than we have, that's one of the good things about the modern world.
Yeah, thank you. So now about basically journalism and news in general, since you've left the newsroom, and you probably have become more of a consumer, as you said, of news and less of a producer of news. What do you think of what's on offer? Is there too much information? Do you find that the way the world is explained in the news makes sense? Do you agree with the priorities? You were mentioning climate change, which clearly is the most important and probably least reported compared to its importance. Can you comment on what you find?
Well, there's a real problem, which I think, so we can all beat ourselves up in the room tonight, and I've done my fair share of beating us all up tonight. Sorry about that, but let's not the public off the hook. And I think there's a real problem with the public. So when I wrote recently about climate change, and somebody in one of the British newspapers rang up and said, well, it's not that we don't write about climate change, but we can measure that our readers read it for 31 seconds, even the most important subjects. And you've now got editors who are very metric obsessed, and their main metric might be, well, I will only publish stuff that drives subscriptions, which sounds logical enough. But suppose, for all kinds of cognitive reasons that we understand, that people actually are frightened to read about climate change, that they won't read about it. Does that mean that you don't cover it? That might end up with a brilliant business model, because you're tailoring stuff to exactly what the readers want to read. It's kind of a catastrophe for the planet, because unless journalists can prepare readers for the tough decisions that politicians are going to have to make, politicians are going to find it very hard. Your President Macron being one of them. What was the question again?
No, well, basically, what was it? What do you think?
Yeah,
what's on offer?
Yeah. It's really. So I suppose I was sort of expressing the difficulty that there is a tension, which I acknowledge and which we all know in this room, between many of our business models, which is what the public is prepared to read, let alone pay for, in order to try and construct some kind of business model that makes sense, and the fact that the public seems incredibly disengaged from this. Now, why is that? Is it the Cancross review goes into this quite a lot, that the kind of apathy amongst a lot of the reading public and saying, well, actually, we don't want to read about councils and courts any longer. We feel so disempowered in the society we live in. We don't believe the politicians. We can't see the link between being a well-informed citizen and a good society. So why should we? And there's lots of sort of pretty good news out there, which is quite shallow, but it's good enough for me because I think we really need to think about this. And it's not all the fault. Some of it's the fault of journalists, but it's not all the fault of journalists. Something has gone badly wrong in the obligations that readers used to feel that they had to read this stuff.
Yeah, it's a bit why I was asking you as well at the beginning, insisting on what do you read, because there are lots of new media. And for example, I'm quite a fan of one called The Intercept, where Glenn Greenwald is associated to in America to follow US politics. And it looks like the news may have gone segmented a bit. And the problem, of course, is that you go towards what you are interested in. You go towards what will confirm your bias or your interest, right?
Well, possibly. You see, I mean, this is the problem with all these things, that because we're 2 minutes into this, the truth is we don't know.
Okay.
So my colleagues in Oxford, Rasmus Nielsen, who's as clever as they come in terms of academics, just says the evidence doesn't stack up on that.
Okay.
He says that the evidence that there are filter bubbles is the opposite of the truth, that actually people are more promiscuous, are reading more diverse sources than at any time in history. Now, instinctively you feel, is that true because that you think the internet does work in a way that reinforces my but that's what he says, and he's working with the Oxford Internet Institute to actually measure the data. So the truth is we don't know.
There is another point that you didn't touch. It's about journalists and possibly their social bias. Like you read English at Cambridge, and I think you took over from a very famous editor who was also in charge for 20 years, who read literature at Oxford. And of course, many journalists and editors come from this elite group that run companies or that run governments and eventually run newspapers. So is that also a problem with what is on offer?
Completely, and it is a really hard one to crack, and I know because I did my best to move the needle at The Guardian. It's especially hard in a declining market. I think if you're in a growing market, it's much easier to take on a multitude of diverse people and to make the newsroom look different. If actually what's happening is that the market is shrinking and the newsroom is getting smaller and people are frightened for their jobs and not leaving, then you have very few opportunities to hire the kind of... so I think you have to start thinking creatively. We started something called Commenters Free in around about 2004, which was an attempt to sort of stave off the Huffington Post because people were laughing at the Huffington Post, even though it was doing something that was infinitely more diverse than most newspapers, and actually the effect of that was to bring many more voices into The Guardian, even though they didn't have staff jobs. But undoubtedly it is a problem.
Do you think, I mean, you raised the question of public service. Do you think that governments should fund journalism to some extent? I mean, France does it to some extent, and but we do see that media are incredibly affiliated more and more to big groups, hence to interests.
Well, it's what's our plan B? Suppose on one hand we think journalism is a public service and is necessary because society can't operate without agreed facts. And suppose, on the other hand, that the market can't deliver that. So then what happens? Well, there are various models of what. So the BBC is one model. The most trusted news organisation in Britain is effectively funded out of taxation. You've mentioned France. Canada has just announced that it's going to make up a fund available for public reporting. In Britain, they've top sliced the BBC's licence fee in order to create about 150 million fund to have reporters in courts and councils. In Sweden, they prop up the weakest title in each community because they think it's wrong to have just one. So there are different models of subsidy, and I think one thing one might think about is whether a news organization couldn't register itself as a kind of social enterprise rather than a business, and say, look, here is the mission, here's the public service, here's the public interest that we think we serve. Nobody's going to make a lot of money out of this. So we're not doing this in order to make shareholders rich, we're doing it because there's a mission. And I think the public is at the point where they would understand that argument, as long as we can make the argument about what journalism is and what public service that we're going to serve. Now, there will be some journalists who will revolt against that and say, I never want a penny in subsidy, and good luck to them. I respect their arguments. But I suspect in 5 years' time, things might look a bit different.
I have one more question. It's a one-word question in 6 letters before I open the floor. Can you guess it?
Oh, God. Yeah. I've come here to escape that, yeah.
So, yeah, what can you tell us about Brexit, just because you come from...
There was a wonderful moment on, does anybody know who Mr. Blobby is? He's a sort of child's character. And there was actually a moment where there was a two-way with a BBC correspondent, and he said, you might as well ask Mr. Blobby rather than me. He said, it was sort of a moment of complete failure of journalism, We have no idea what's going on. Theresa May has no idea. I mean, the whole thing is completely out of control. And so I could give you an answer now that would be ridiculous in 3 hours' time, because we don't know. I mean, it's in a way it's a perfect illustration of the horizontal world. You say, well, you decide, and then the vertical world is left thinking, oh, crikey, how are we supposed to implement that, and what's the relationship between that, and you've got a parliamentary system that is completely at odds with the popular plebiscite, and nobody knows how to resolve those two worlds.
But the role of the media has been questioned and criticized a lot in Brexit, right? Because maybe they use too much of their vertical authority to not apparently inform the public well enough.
Yeah, I mean, I find
Has there been a bit of soul searching in the UK about that?
I hope so. I mean, I hope somebody does I think there will be a huge public inquiry into this at the end, and I hope it looks into the role of the media. I mean, I find it... Is there anybody from the Daily Telegraph here? I mean, I find... The Daily Telegraph used to be, whatever you thought of its politics, it was a really fine news paper and really reliable news reporting. And there's a chapter in my book which looks at a dismal story about how the commercial side took over the newsroom. That's a really sad story now. But you look at it and regularly they splash on Boris Johnson in the most ridiculous way, as though that's got anything to do... Well, of course, Boris Johnson is a player, but where is the cool Daily Telegraph of old that would just give you the facts, By all means have Boris Johnson, but don't splash. So this sort of throwback to the 19th century where, because you had a printing press, it was your role to try and dragoon people into thinking the way that you thought. That was a role of the press in the days when people bought printing presses precisely to do that. Richard Desmond's the last gasp of that. But in 2019, is that going to build trust in the press? I mean, it might speak to a tiny minority, a subsection of Telegraph readers who want to be told that, but that I mean, talk about filter bubbles, that is the ultimate filter bubble.
Great, well, we'll open the floor to questions now. Please introduce yourself. We'll start with Natasha here.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. My name is Natasha Khan. I work for the Wall Street Journal. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your thoughts on the remaking of journalism in China, where, as you mentioned, you were in front of Parliament and people were asking you, do you love your country? And I think these are questions that especially, journalists based in China or of Chinese descent are sort of asked sometimes when they're, being questioned for the motives behind their stories. So I'm just wondering, especially because there, is the need more than ever for the fourth estate there.
Well, I don't know enough about journalism in China, but I can tell you what I think, which I thought about a lot during Snowden. So at one point, we were of course criticised for what we were doing. I touched on that, and the British government said, which is a trope throughout history, which doesn't mean that it's not true, but they said, you will have blood on your hands, this is not in the national interest, and you must stop. Nixon said that. The Callahan government said it. The Wilson government said it. I mean, this is what governments always said. It's what George W. Bush said to Bill Keller. Don't publish the story about warrantless wiretapping because it's not in the national interest. And Bill, if you remember, delayed publishing for a year until James Risen said, okay, well, I'm going to write a book about it. So you have to, and there was a former colleague of mine who wrote a column at the time saying, well, if the government told me that it wasn't in the national interest to publish something, who am I to disagree with them? And I thought, really? Isn't that the most fundamental thing about journalism, that we are an independent estate? And that's why we're journalists. And that if, ultimately, whatever else we agree on tonight, we have to agree that the point of journalism is that it stands apart from all other sources of power, whether corporate or state or whatever. And unless you believe that an editor can make those decisions and can be free to publish, then you don't believe in a free press. If you don't believe that, because that's what a free press is. Now, you can subsequently criticize the editor, and you can lock him up or imprison him or do whatever you like if he or she has made terrible decisions and has behaved irresponsibly. But if you can't accept the basic premise that journalists should be free to think independently of the state, then journalism loses its rationale. That's what I think.
Next question, over there in the veranda. Gentleman in the white shirt. Yes.
Thank you. My name's Daniel. I work for Finance Asia. It's a question around the business model. I'm quite fascinated by the transition from print to online. It seems that, well, I may be wrong, but most publications went essentially free to air online. And I wonder whether we've really thought very carefully about the implications of that transition by allowing basically content to be free online. So we talk about the Guardian's online business model, but no one ever queried paying on the newsstand, but we seem to now query paying online. So for a lot of smaller titles, that online revenue doesn't exist because people don't assume that it should be paid for at all. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, but I'd be interested to hear it.
Well, if you can ever be, if you can ever bring yourself to buy the book, there's a lot about that stuff. So, if you look at the time, what people were trying to do, it wasn't that people. Some people say, oh, the original sin of giving it away for free. Well, lots of people tried paywalls at many points from about 1998 onwards, and most of them failed. Nearly all of them failed. If you remember, the New York Times tried it, then dropped it. The Sun, more recently, has tried it and dropped it. The Irish Times tried it and dropped it. Everyone tried it, and they dropped it. And And there were academics who did surveys right across the world, and people just didn't manage to do it. And then the tide began to turn, and some titles did manage to do it, and God bless them. I've got no criticism at all. I mean, it does bring problems with it that we have to accept. I quote Dean Baquet of the New York Times in the book, who's got one of the most successful paywalls, saying it's great, but I sometimes worry about the 98% of Americans who don't read the New York Times, because the moment you paywall your content, then you leave the playing field free for anybody else who wants to flood that area with news that might be right or wrong. So there are downsides to paywalls as well as upsides. But in Britain, still 93% of people don't pay for news. Now, we can call them reprehensible and so on and so forth, but it's quite a big thing to say, well, I'm going to risk my title on doing that. And as I say, The Guardian had readers who weren't rich, 23,000 a year. 2/3 of our readers were abroad, online. We were the 8th biggest paper in print. We only started when I was editing with 400,000. And at that point, if you put a paywall up, you lost 95% of your readership overnight. So that's why we moved into America. We lost a lot of money in America, though it's now profitable, and half the revenue is coming from readers. We moved to Australia, paid for by a philanthropist who thought it was bad for Australia to be so dominated by one owner. We lost a lot of money on that, but we said we'll pay you back if we start making money. Well, sadly to say, we started to make money in Australia, so we're having to pay him back. So I think there's no shortcut to this. The one thing that we know doesn't work is to try and cut your way out of it. You know, there are enough American newspapers who just cut and cut and cut and lost their audience and their rationale and their advertising, and it's very difficult to get back from that. So if people, if it turns out that the public are willing to pay, that's great, but as I think I suggested by the ordering of my questions, you can't start with that. You have to work out, well, what is it that you're going to ask them to pay for?
Next question, over here.
Thank you. My name's Erin Hale. I'm a freelance journalist. I was wondering if you could talk about the changing class dynamics in journalism, where you used to have, people out of high school becoming a reporter, and now you basically need a master's degree and to be able to do 2 or 3 unpaid internships. Maybe you'll be a contract worker for many years without health care, which basically means you need to be middle class or upper middle class, especially in Asia, if you want to be a foreign correspondent. Can you talk about the impact that has had on journalism, or anything in your view?
Yeah, I do think it's a really serious thing, and it's something I'm thinking about a lot at Oxford, because in a way, what we call high status universities have the same problem, that they have started recruiting almost exclusively from the top 20% of society, and it's a question we're now asking ourselves in education. Well, don't we have a sort of moral duty to take people from low income backgrounds, even though they may not have exactly the same grades as the people from better off backgrounds? And how you engineer that is a thing that education is thinking about. But I do think in a world in which things like Brexit, things like Trump, things like the populist movements in Europe, it's a very dangerous thing to have elites who are communicating to themselves and not reflecting or being able to talk the language of or speak to or listen to everyone else. That's a really dangerous thing for any country. So I think it's a very high priority for newsrooms to recruit as diversely as possible. And in the same way that in Oxford, in Lady Margaret Hall, where I am, we started a little bridging program, because we think, well, okay, we shouldn't assume that people from very low incomes are going to have 3 A stars, nor do we want to lower our standards, but we can spend a bit of money trying to bridge that gap. So we'll have them for a year to And so whether that looks like internships, but not for wealthy kids, but for different kinds of kids. So I think thinking about internships is a very useful thing. I mean, we banned giving internships to anybody who came sort of via a friend, or so we started deliberately using internship schemes in order to target radically different kinds of people. That's one way of doing it.
Next question, yes, Jody here.
Thank you. I'm Jody Schneider with Bloomberg, and I'm on the Board of Governors here at the FCC. You said a lot of fascinating things, many of them troubling. One of the most troubling to me was that nobody, or a lot of people, a preponderance of people, can't tell the difference between journalism and not journalism. And we had thought in journalism that one of the benefits that we gave people was that we graded the news. We made it clear what was important, and kind of separated ourselves from the noise of the internet. What are we doing wrong in a larger sense if we can't do that?
Well, again, I think we shouldn't underestimate the difficulty that the public has. So there's never been a time in history when so many sources have been so freely available. And if you ever go and talk at a school, if you ever go and talk to schools, or even at university level to some extent, and talk to young people who are really struggling with the most basic concepts of what is reliable and what isn't reliable. We shouldn't underestimate that. I was in Singapore 2 days ago and did a talk to the cleverest university, the scholars at Singapore National University. And one of them said at the end, face it, your newspaper loses money. The Daily Mail makes shed loads of money. They've got a far bigger audience than you have. Who are you to say that you're a better newspaper than the Daily Mail? So I said, okay, fair point. I said, well, somebody call up the Daily Mail, will you, and let's just have a look at it. And banner headline across the thing was something, I mean, some of you will have followed the story more closely than I did. Mel B or Mel C or Mel A was in love with one of the other Spice Girls and claimed to have had sex with her. I mean, I didn't get beyond the headline, but that was the headline across the whole front page. And then when we went down the sidebar of shame and read the first 5 headlines of the sidebar of shame, and I said, yeah, they have a bigger audience than The Guardian, and they're infinitely more profitable. Is that better journalism? And the room sort of fell quiet because it was pretty obvious what I thought the answer was. But there are the students at Oxford, right? I say, where do you get your news from? And they say, Facebook. And you say, that's great. Where did it come from before Facebook? And they look blank and they say, don't know, what are you talking about? And you say, well, Facebook doesn't have any reporters. So it's come from somewhere before Facebook. So I think there's a huge media literacy project, whatever you want to call it, in which we have to not assume that people are remotely equipped now to be able to read the signals, and maybe we ought to be thinking harder about how we reinforce those signals.
Yes. Sorry, I was pointing at the gentleman there. Yeah. Next one after.
Hi, Gregor Hunter, also from Bloomberg. You alluded briefly to the Scott Trust, and I'm interested in how you reflect in the role of an endowment as a means of funding a news organisation. And I'd just like to get some thoughts from you on what you thought some of the opportunities and constraints were of that. Clearly, as you ran through an enviable run of exclusives and headlines, you also had the backings of a very large pool of funds to do so.
Could you just hold your microphone a bit closer, because I'm not picking.
We don't hear very well.
So the question was, to what extent is having an endowment model like the Scott Trust, how has that been? Is that something that could serve as helpful for other media organisations, particularly in this area?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Scott Trust is a fantastic model. For those of you who don't know about the Scott Trust, we made a lot of money out of second-hand cars over here. So we had a magazine called Auto Trader, and somebody had the brilliant idea of buying this magazine called Auto Trader, and it just sells second-hand cars, and made huge profits. And at some point they thought, well, we're going to have to turn this into a website because blah, blah, blah. They turned it into a website. It made even bigger profits. And at that, so we got really nervous because we thought eBay or Google or Murdoch or somebody's going to come in and steal that business. So we sold it and we put it into an endowment. And this was set up by the Scott family in the 1930s, and nobody ever made a penny out of it, and nobody has made a penny out of the Guardian ever since. The money just goes back into the Guardian, and it is there in order to support the Guardian. That's what was there for. It's a great model. The problem is that you need to begin with the endowment, and there are not many people who can, Jeff Bezos can probably do that. There are not many people who could create a really meaty endowment. But as I said before, our quotes endowment was tiny compared with the Barclay brothers or Rupert Murdoch. I mean, it just got us onto the playing field. We couldn't behave in an irresponsible fashion. But I do think there is a sort of idea there of something that is not. It's not even. It seeks to make a profit. The Guardian doesn't often succeed. But in a sense, that's not its point. No one ever thought that was the point of the Guardian. It's had a different kind of mission. And my feeling is that that's the way a lot of corporations will end up going, partly because they're not going to make profits. And so if governments could change the system of incentives so that they're not quite charities, because I think that would be difficult, but say that we could have a social purpose company or a social enterprise or a mission-driven company in which people could invest but not expect traditional returns, then I think that is something. It sort of slightly ties in with the subsidy question from earlier. I think that's something that people will end up thinking about.
Yes, the question here.
You. And I am Carmen, and I'm a journalism student, and I'm a bit greedy. I have two questions. And as you said, journalism is changing, and to be a good journalist, what quality as an editor that you are looking for, that new generation that we need to equip ourselves to be a good journalist? And my second question is that The Guardian is putting a lot of effort in putting content on social media such as Instagram, and it got significant numbers of subscribers, which reached 1.6 million. However, like just you have said, the content that put on Instagram is to cater the need of the reader, and is like much lighter and more informal. And the purpose of putting news on social media is to involve more engagement, but the content is much lighter, so you can't actually reach the purpose of interacting with readers that you really want to talk to the content. So how would you make the balance in between this? Thank you.
Well, the first question about what makes a good journalist, I heard Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, talk about this recently, and he said that he only ever hires optimists. And I thought that's a really good answer. So we all know, you work at when we were doing this great transformation on The Guardian, there were always 20% who thought it was hopeless and doomed, and it was moonshine, and the editor didn't know what he was doing. And you were never going to persuade them. But you worked with the 20% who were passionate about it, and the people in the middle were persuadable. And I think Marty meant that, okay, we've spoken about some of the challenges tonight in a way that's easy to speak about the challenges, but if you want to be a journalist, there's no point in going into journalism. You're going to be gloomy about it. Your generation can go in and do something dramatic, and you can change things. And I hope you're going to go into journalism because you want to change the world and do a public service. So that's a great and honourable thing to do, but be optimistic about it. There are many of the traditional skills of journalism, the traditional skills of journalists are the same. We've got to be able to be accurate and be quick and blah, blah, blah. But I think there is a frame of mind question that still believes some of the things that I believe tonight. This is an important thing to do in society, and we've got to convince people, and people need journalists, but it's a sort of uphill struggle to make that work and to persuade them. So I think that's the answer to the first one. On the answer to the second one, so I didn't quite finish that point about the Guardian was 400,000. I think the latest figures are now 180 million browsers, whatever that, it's not quite the same as users. 180 million. And usually the accusation about the Guardian is that it's really boring. So I feel that we didn't do much clickbait. We didn't do stuff that was driving people in order simply to get the figures up. And it's a minor miracle, I think, that we can be that boring and get that enormous audience by writing about social policy and politics and social justice and the environment and science and penal policy and defense and national security and corruption. These are not clickbait subjects. But of course, we know that it's always been a technique of journalism to have a mix. It would be boring just to read about social justice and national security. And papers are rightly interested in gender and women and childbearing and sex and relationships and fashion and culture. And a slightly separate question is whether that glue that held all those subjects together in a thing called a newspaper is going to survive in an age when people come in to search for individual things. But at the moment it seems to work, and if people come in because they want to read about sex or relationships or mental health, and they stay and read about Brexit, brackets, you have to have really clever technologists to work out how to grab them while they're there reading the piece about the polka dot dress that everyone's wearing this year and divert them into Brexit. But so you need really clever developers who can work out how journeys are going. But I don't think it's a dishonourable thing to write about that stuff.
Next question.
Yeah, hello, Alan. Eric Wishart from AFP. And just a little comment before I ask you the question is the AFP does have a mission of public interest, and we receive about 40% of our revenues through government subsidies, direct or indirectly. And I think we're an example also of how you can be independent journalistically and do that just as the BBC obviously is. I wanted to ask you your analysis of the coverage of, do we call it Russiagate still? The American media has been, mainstream media as they call it, has been plunged into another of these kind of introspective kind of crises over the coverage. They went through a similar exercise with the election when Trump won. How did we get the story so wrong? Also with the weapons with mass destruction. After A.G. Sulzberger was here a few months back, and when the New York Times came out with this extraordinary mea culpa a year after the war saying, we just followed this narrative. And again, looking at the American media particularly fell into a narrative on Clinton. Trump couldn't win. They fell into this. They appeared to fall into a narrative on the Russiagate. They got things mixed up between Russian interference and the Trump campaign. You were the editor responsible for some extraordinary investigative reporting, so you've been there, you know what it's all about. So I'd like to hear your analysis, particularly when you spoke about Glenn Greenwald, and if you follow him in The Intercept, he is extremely critical of the American media's coverage, and then he came out, I think it was yesterday, and just absolutely lacerated them over the coverage of the Russian so-called collusion. So I'd be interested to see what you think about that.
Well, it's I mean, these are extraordinary times, and they're really difficult things for newsrooms to cover. So you kind of sort of sympathise with the problems that the American press are having in working out how to deal with Trump. You know, it's a sort of vertical, horizontal thing, and I do like. You know, the Marty Barons were not at war, we're at work, and David Remnick, you know, we're going to have to be as good as we can possibly be in order to... So not losing your head and accepting that we live in exceptional times, this is an exceptional president. How do you deal with a president who lies thousands of times and who tries to delegitimize what you do in order to speak directly to people? I mean, these are problems that no editor's ever had to face up to before. And I do think we should denigrate some remarkable reporting, fabulous reporting from many broadcast outlets, as well as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. But nevertheless, sometimes these American papers do feel obsessive in their coverage. Maybe the British papers feel obsessive about Brexit, and it's difficult not to be obsessive about it. And in a way it relates to the question about the social makeup of reporting staff. And in a world in which the local press has been hollowed out, not to fall into the trap of reporting on the flyover states as though they were a foreign country, and to work out how to root yourself in those communities so that you understand them and can represent them faithfully in a world in which of limited budgets. I mean, all these things are not difficult problems to solve, but you know, undoubtedly there have been some wrong turnings, and some of those have burnt trust in the press in precisely the way that Trump would want. But in my experience, the American press is very good at being reflective about itself and holding itself up for criticism. I mean, you talk about self-flagellation. I would rather that than a kind of sort of complacent shrug, which is sometimes what the British press feels like. And by the way, where did media coverage go? You know, the criticism we had when we wrote about the criminal behaviour within News International, that dog shouldn't eat dog, and it was a bad form to write about other journalists. I think we should not be afraid of writing about each other and of critiquing each other and discussing the kinds of things we're discussing in this room tonight.
Yes, the gentleman here. The mic there, please, on the left.
Brian, oh gosh, that's quite loud. So I'm a student at Wolfson College. I'm doing a master's there right now, and I'd just like to sort of press you on a question concerning the issue of echo chambers. One of the main One of the main causes cited for the political sort of stalemate we're in right now is effectively the rise of echo chambers in terms of how social media, but also conventional media discourses have played out between the public and also the media, and vice versa. So I guess my question is, do you think that there's an obligation on the part of media to break these sort of sets of echo chambers and I have no idea what's going on the mic, to try and reach out to opposite audiences, to cross the metaphorical alley and effectively try and reach out to folks on the right if you're in a Guardian and if you're in a Telegraph, to reach out to folks on the left, to try and reach some sort of possible communication channel to bridge the gaps and differences. I think that's possibly a solution or a way out of the deadlocks and stalemates you see right now. And I was just wondering if that's indeed the case, what do you think are the achieving that in that sense?
I do, well, again, as a reader, as I described about Brexit, I sort of thought the last thing I'm really interested in is having an opinion on the front page. You know, can we do the traditional thing here? You know, let's do the news first, Give me your analysis next. Give me the context. If you want to tell me your opinion, fine. That would be a nice bonus. Though, by the way, there's a lot of opinion on the internet too. But what you can do that no one else can do, or theoretically, is to do the reporting. And that, in a sense, ought to be sort of reasonably free of polarities, because you're just dealing in facts. And maybe I feel there's not enough of that. This is a feature of the modern world, that you see things and then you can't remember where you've seen them. Somebody on Twitter in the last 48 hours was talking about how even the BBC now is so attracted by the most vociferous, colourful characters. Nigel Farage is an extraordinary character. Jacob Rees-Mogg, you couldn't make him up. And so you get these figures who are sort of Donald Trump, they're sort of mesmeric. You can't take your eyes off them in a way. But as journalists, I think we need to paint in the greys and represent the people who know what they're talking about, even if it's a bit boring sometimes, because we what is our duty? What is the public interest? What is the public service? What is journalism? Unless we can sometimes pull it back to what we think the public needs and will respect us for and will want, then we do get drawn into dancing to the tune of people who are very adept at it. Comes back to your question, Eric. Trump is brilliant, particularly if he wants to distract us. He says, "Oh, look over there. Here's this sort of fish I've lobbed over there," because he doesn't want you to report the thing over there. And that's the time when you absolutely have to just stick to the journalistic last.
Yes, Edith?
Gosh, this microphone is a little bit bizarre, but I'll try. Edith Terry, former journalist. I just wanted to challenge you a little bit on your basic thesis, which is that technology and this sort of horizontal versus vertical axis have changed the tables on journalism. Technology is a tool, and the internet is our latest tool. My question is, if you look back over the last 30 to 40 years of journalism, is it really technology that has changed the game, or the dominance of kind of the market-driven model of what journalism should be? And I have to say, the cowardice and the penchant for being bullied by the business side of many major publications and minor ones. So that my question is it really a failure of the technology and the business model, or a failure of leadership and editorial vision? As you talk, the subtext that I hear is that the true failure is one of editorial vision.
Well, it's all of those things. So the chapter on the Telegraph is about ownership. Why did the Barclay brothers want to own this paper? What is their motive? Is it a profit motive? Is it an influence motive? And how did it come that the business side was able to dictate to journalists the pieces that they should and shouldn't be writing, and could kill the pieces that they... How did that happen? How did journalists let it happen? Why did the business side want... So that's a story about proprietors, an old story. It's a story about motive, to some extent an old story. It's about new commercial forces. So all that is part of the picture, but I think the extreme revolution of allowing 4 billion people the means to publish is of an order of magnitude different, and it's to do with how society now talks to each other, and it's to do with profound shifts in conversation and power and the way that the world organizes itself. I just do think that. I don't think anybody could seriously contest that. And if your job was the person who had the megaphone and had the job of reporting on that, it's such a changed context that I think you can't avoid putting that up there as one of the most major things. But I'm not disagreeing with you that all those other factors are there too.
We may have time for one more question, if there is. Otherwise, yes, okay. Oh, okay. Mr. Lawrence there.
Thank you. I'm not a journalist. My name is David Lawrence, Associate Member of the FCC. We talked about business models. When I first came to Hong Kong, there was a newspaper called the Herald Tribune. And I always used to enjoy the Herald Tribune because the editors always put two sides of the argument. So I could read the Herald Tribune, it's only about 10 pages, and in those 10 pages there would be a column arguing point A and a column arguing point B. I think that's an excellent business model for your profession.
Yes, I wouldn't disagree. I mean, it's a complicated thing if you're... So all countries are different, so every market is different. I mean, if you're in the British market and you've got the sort of press that I showed you earlier, so in the coverage of the defining issue for Britain in the last 70 years, the press behaves in the way that I've showed you. And it's 2-to-1 on one side, and a lot of people hammering home the point without explaining it. I wasn't the editor of The Guardian at the time, but I can imagine what that feels like. You think, well, somebody's got to put the other side of the case, and they've got the lion's share of the voice already, and there's a sort of democratic compulsion to put the other side of the case. And the danger is you then end up doing the reverse of what they're doing. And thankfully, reading The Guardian, that's not what they've done. I mean, when I was editing, I definitely wanted Simon Jenkins in the mix, and Max Hastings, and Matt Dancona, as well as Polly Toynbee and Jonathan Friedland and Gary Young. I thought it was right to challenge the readers and not just feed what they might think of their prejudices. And I think it's just more interesting. I think it's more interesting to be challenged, and you get closer to the truth by having that sort of dialectical argument between two sides. So I think I would agree with you, but I can also see how it is that you get trapped into one side or the other.
Well, okay, one last one, and actually dessert is being served at the same time. So yes, take the last question, please.
Can you hear me? Oh, God. Hi. Sorry.
The FCC is famous for its technology mastery.
Steve Proctor, former print journalist, now doing something slightly less respectable. I have a 22-year-old daughter who's reasonably well informed, but has never bought a newspaper, and I don't think is ever likely to. What is the future of print journalism? Or does it have one? I mean, more precisely say, when will The Guardian and The Times discontinue their print editions, in your opinion, Alan?
Well, I assume that every newspaper has got we had a little computer in the basement that was doing the algorithm that would tell us when it was time to switch off the newspaper. And we would go down and ask it each week, is it time yet? And the computer would say no, because it generates a lot of cash. The more people hand over their money, that's a cash flow. But I think that the decline in print in the UK is remorselessly about 10% a year, and you don't have to be a compound economist to work out that can't go on forever. So we know that print at some point will stop. I think it's unarguable. When that is, I don't know. Will daily papers turn into weekly papers? Probably. Will they start thinking about publishing digests, a lighter digest during the week and a heavy paper at the end? I don't know, but it seems to me inevitable. I mean, in any audience of young people, again, at the Singapore National University the other day, I said, does anybody read The Guardian? And actually, most of the hands went up. I said, does anybody pay for The Guardian? One hand went up. I said, okay, so we got the nature of the problem in the room here. I've got daughters as well. They would never dream of buying a newspaper, but they're very, very well informed. So that's really the story of my editorship. In 1995, I thought that's what was going to happen, and if I didn't move The Guardian or try to move The Guardian from print to digital, there would be no Guardian in 30 years' time. And I didn't succeed in tying everything up neatly any more than most people have, but it seemed to me absolutely necessary to try and move onto the other plane. And is that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Nobody knows, but you have to be ready for it when it comes.
Well, thank you immensely for sharing with us your very interesting thoughts and your many doubts. I think we all agree that we don't know much. We heard that in Oxford people are still wearing ties, so because we're trying to clear our stock of FCC ties, you have a very special souvenir there. It's disappearing just like print, so hold on to it. And please give a big round of applause to Ellen. And please enjoy your desserts now and wine and stay around as long as you want. And we will show the Birds Bar later on to Mr. Rusbridger because he's a pianist as well. And we have live music downstairs. So make the most of the club tonight.